Zeno of Leia. Little background for Zeno. It's not important to confuse him with Zima or Zemo or other things. He's Zeno. He was born approximately 490 BC, died in 433 BC, approximately, and is approximately still dead today. He wrote a book of about 50 arguments, countering the critics of his master Parmenides. So he's in the Eleatic school defending Parmenides. One of his favorite techniques was the reductio ad absurdum, which we saw when we talked about argument basics, and we'll see more in the future. It's a useful philosophical device. And this, of course, involves reducing something to absurdity, where you assume something is true, you derive a absurdity, a contradiction, or impossibility from it, and then conclude from this that it must be false. You can also reverse it to prove that something is true. So what he would do in his particular applications was he would take the position of one of Parmenides' critics and show that this position would lead to a contradiction or absurdity. And the reasonable conclusion would be that the critic was wrong and Parmenides was right. And his arguments made him philosophically famous. Zeno's famous paradoxes. And he's probably famous for real, not just philosophically, because Zeno's paradox is one of those things that kind of like, Descartes' I think therefore am, or does a tree fall in a forest? It's one of those things that gets kind of in popular understanding. So what are some of his paradoxical and seemingly strange arguments? Well, one is an argument he gives against the senses. And it goes like this. Premise 1. If a millet seed is dropped, it'll make no noise. Premise 2. If a bushel of millet seeds is dropped, a noise will be heard. Premise 3. Either millet seeds make a sound when dropped, or they do not. So premise 4. If they do not make a sound, as per premise 1, then our senses deceive us about premise 2. Premise 5. If they do make a sound, premise 2, then our senses deceive us about premise 1. Either way, the senses deceive us. Although this argument is logically appealing, it does run into some obvious problems. Namely, in premise 1, if millet seed is dropped, it'll make no noise. One thing that perhaps Zeno didn't consider is that there would be noises outside the range of human hearing. And so if you had, a creature like a dog perhaps with exceptional hearing, it might be able to hear the drop of a millet seed. Or, more likely, if you had a, super high gain microphone, it would be able to hear that sound, or capture the sound very, very easily. Although you could, of course, if you wanted to be, clever in the argument, is make a distinction between, noise, something being produced, and hearing it. So there's what we hear, which depends on obviously what we hear, and then there's the production of, sound itself. It's kind of like talking about temperature versus whether something's warm or cold. So temperature would be an objective measurement of what's out there, and whether it's warm or cold would be how we experience it. So, and as you might imagine, philosophers cash in a lot on those distinctions to make various arguments. So, a clever argument, and logically good. The main dispute would be with the premises. He also gave a lot of arguments, about 40, against plurality. Here's an example of one of them. Premise 1, suppose many objects exist, which seems like a reasonable supposition. Second, each object must have a specific size, which is also seemingly a reasonable claim. Third, any object can be infinitely divided into multiple parts. An object can be cut in half, and the halves can be cut in half, and so on. So premise 4, if an object is made of an infinite number of parts, each with some size, then the object must be infinite. This is absurd, he concludes in the reductio, so there can only be one infinite object. Now, in terms of assessing this reasoning, one obvious question is about premise 3, namely, can an object be infinitely divided into infinite parts? And so this is a question about fundamental metaphysics. Is there a fundamental entity that cannot be divided? To use a metaphor, if you had a magical sword that could cut anything in half, that could be cut, that this would be uncuttable, unbreakable, that it has no parts. And so there is this fundamental question in metaphysics and also physics: how far down can things be cut? I don't mean just in terms of what we can cut, because we can split the atom now. They may be beyond our capacity to split, but there is the question of whether there is something that would be metaphysically unsplittable. That not that we can't do it, but it simply would be impossible. That even, to get super metaphysical, that even God couldn't split it in half. It raises questions about God's power, etc. So an interesting question about it, whether you can split things infinitely or not, if you hit something unsplittable. And so an interesting argument, and raises the usual sort of problems with infinity, and we'll see the use of infinity throughout the course of the course. It's something that creates a lot of problems. Now, the thing that Zeno is probably best known for, at least in sort of popular culture, are his paradox of motion. And there are 4 different arguments for this. I'll just give one of them because they basically work the same way. And so one version is called Achilles and the tortoise, kind of like but not the same as the classic tortoise and the hare. So we have the following scenario. We have a runner trying to get from a starting point to a finish line. Now, to get from the starting point, the starting line, to the finish line, the runner must first travel half the distance from the starting point to the finish line. So say they were doing a 2-mile race, they would have to run, a mile and then the next mile. Now, of course, before the person can get to the halfway point, the mile mark, they must get halfway to the halfway point, the half-mile mark, and so on, to the quarter mile, etc., all the way down. So at any point in the run, the runner's goal is a distance that can be divided by half. And this distance can be divided into, you can probably guess where this is going, an infinite number of points. So if there's an infinite number of points to run, the runner will take an infinite amount of time to get to the goal. This is impossible, hence motion is impossible. Now again, this is a clever argument, and it relies, on the notion of infinity and mathematics and so forth. Now others, of course, when responding to it, use a reductio of their own, namely that since if you look at race results for races, people clearly do finish them with various times. And so one could take that as a reductio on this argument. Now, of course, Parmenides, and Zeno was a follower of Parmenides, took the view that we should go with reason over our senses. So what Parmenides would do, if he were not dead, he would counter by saying, oh yes, your senses tell you that people, finish these 5Ks and 10Ks and marathons and half marathons, but that your senses are deceiving you. No one ever finished. And of course, no one ever started either, because there's no way to have any motion at all. Now, some see this as, a good philosophical approach to show there is no motion. Others see it as just sort of clever use of logic to prove a point that is absurd. But in any case, it is pretty clever. So why was the Eleatic school important? Why were Parmenides and Zeno and their fellows, why do we still talk about them today? Well, one reason is that they developed a logical philosophical method. Secondly, they contributed greatly to the ongoing philosophical debate, also scientific debate, between reason and the senses. mean, even today, laying aside, kind of these seemingly crazy cases of, there being no motion, what science tells us about the world clashes with what our senses tell us. A good example is we human beings, we have color vision, so we see colors. But of course, science tells us that colors are not out there. That it essentially is our, crudely put, essentially photons impact our retina, signals go down the optic nerve into our brain, and then we, colorize our experiences. But our experience seems to tell us color's out there. Science tells us it's not. And there are many cases, of course, where our senses tell us one thing, but reason tells us another. And in this case, it doesn't seem crazy. It seems correct. They also created logical and mathematical problems that have kept people busy for centuries. People still, like talking about Zeno's paradox. Most people think it's clearly crazy because of the senses, but it's an interesting argument. They also began the method of considering the logical implication of words and concepts, which becomes ever more important in philosophy. In fact, some would say that eventually it hits a point that being focused too much on logical implications of words and language becomes a bit of, philosophy gets kind of pathological, perhaps for a while, perhaps still is. They also set a precedent for following arguments to their logical conclusion, even when these conclusions seem counterintuitive. Now, this creates, kind of an interesting problem for philosophy and science, which is this. It's something I mentioned before when, considering like conspiracy theories or ideas that are just, completely, seemingly crazy. So an argument could lead you to something that seems utterly counterintuitive, just totally ludicrous. But there are conclusions that seem well established in science, philosophy, etc., that are completely counterintuitive. That there is no color out there seems initially kind of crazy. That there is no taste. There's no flavor out in the world. That flavor is interaction between your parts of your cells on your tongue and the shape of objects. Their chemical composition. And so we have to be able to distinguish between when we're following an argument to its logical conclusion sort of sensibly, and when we go off, hard off the rails. And of course, there are cases where we take an argument and we do follow to its logical conclusion, and the logic is all good, but it leads us to a place of, wherein lies madness. And kind of interesting problem. And one of the kind of the fascinating areas in critical thinking and logic, again, is taking things to a logical conclusion that lead to, say, a conspiracy theory that seems totally, absurd, more, science fiction or horror than reality, and following things to a logical conclusion that also seem counterintuitive. Now, the quality of the arguments given by Parmenides and his fellows forced other philosophers, beginning with our good dead friends Plato and Aristotle, to address the problems they raised. And later examinations of their work did show some interesting problems, namely making logical inferences from language to metaphysics. A good example of this is the problem with the word is. And of course it's equivalent in Greek, because they didn't have the word is in Greek. They had the Greek word that works like is. And same for other languages. So is can be taken at least three ways in English. One is the is of existence. So if you say that something is, you're saying that it exists. Also, there's the is of identity. So if you say, for example, Superman is, that'd be saying that he exists. If you say Superman is Clark Kent, sorry, spoilers, that would be an is of identity. They are the same, it's the same thing. There's also the is of predication. So if you say Superman is a humanoid, you're not saying that he's identical to that, you're saying that he has that quality. Or if you say that an apple is red or green, you're not saying that it's identical to green. You're saying that it has the quality of green. And so, basically words can be problematic. Another example is the example of like nobody or nothing. In Alice's Adventures Through the Looking Glass, better known as Alice in Wonderland, there's a passage about, a clever passage about nobody walking. And also another example is like talking about nothing. You can play some language games with nothing, because nothing is nothing, but you might also say it's something. Because if you have a box that holds everything, what's something that's outside the box besides itself? Well, the answer would be nothing. But is this nothing a thing outside the box or not? And so our language kind of makes us talk about nothing as a thing, but it's nothing. And it gets really weird, super weird, and all kinds of problems. So language is a mess. I guess that's the inference. Now, our good dead friend Plato addressed a lot of these problems of language in the Sophist. And then later philosophers spent a lot of time battling with language. For example, when you look at our good dead friend David Hume, he kind of has a bit of a breakdown at the end of, spoilers, at the end of his discussion of personal identity, where he just kind of says, after doing all this work on trying to solve it, he says, it's all language. And then it just gets worse from there. So that takes us to the end of our good dead friend Parmenides and Zeno. And as always, stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.